Hi, Aaron. Hi, Cleve.
Hi.
Hey, Martine.
So, as you both know, we have a presidential debate coming up next week. And I have a confession, which is that I love hearing about debate prep. I love hearing what the prep is like, how the candidates are prepping, who is playing the opposition in the prep.
And I also wonder how into it they get. You know, is there a wig? Is there a suit?
Are they using the voice?
Yeah. Do they adjust the height?
I feel like it's like campaigns take 2 weeks in the summer to just go to theater camp and just play pretend in the middle of the woods somewhere. And I think it's great. Welcome to The Campaign Moment. It's Friday, September 6th. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week again by Washington Post White House reporter Cleve Wootson.
Hey, glad to be here.
So this week, we're obviously going to be talking about that debate, and Cleve will be there in Philadelphia. And I'll be curious to get his take on what's going to go down there. But we're also going to dive into some other news from the campaign trail this week, specifically some big fundraising numbers for the Harris campaign, as well as a couple big endorsements from some high-profile Republicans.
So we're excited to get into all of that. But Cleve, first, I was hoping to hear a little bit from you about what this moment in politics has been like for you to cover. And of course, we've had you on the show recently. You've been on the Campaign Moment and Post Report a few times since Harris became the nominee. But I was thinking about it, and your job for the last 3.5 years, a big part of it has been covering Kamala Harris and covering the vice president's office. And I think it's probably fair to say that that's not always at the center of the political universe or what people are caring about in the news. And then all of a sudden, she becomes the center of everything when it comes to covering Democrats and a huge part of this race. So what has it been like for you to see that switch, for you to go from covering Harris in somewhat obscurity, maybe that's going too far, to covering this person who could very well be the next president?
Yeah, there was definitely a point when I was following Kamala Harris in Ghana and I got sick. And I'm just sick in a hotel room in Africa, thinking, what am I doing with my life?
Why am I here?
Where have I gone wrong? Yeah, you're right. Most vice presidents toil in obscurity. And that means that the reporters who are following them around are also kind of toiling in obscurity. That's different for Harris. She was a historic figure from the start. 3 months ago, we were in that sort of obscure area. The debate, the questions, the attention, the focus was all about Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. And then suddenly it wasn't. And it has been exciting and exhausting ever since. I do think of myself as a Kamala Harris. I think Aaron called me a Kamala Harris subject matter expert.
Yeah, I heard that on the episode.
Many people are saying.
Is that on the business card?
Should be.
And so in this moment, I feel like every story that I write, even the ones that are a daily story about, Kamala Harris said this today, I bring all this context, history, and I feel a very strong sense of responsibility to make sure that all gets in there. I want people to get the whole picture, not some of it.
Well, and I think an example of how that context becomes important is a story that you published this morning, right, with our colleague Dan Diamond, that was basically about Kamala Harris as a boss. And we've talked about this on the show before, but, over the years, there are numbers that demonstrate that, her office had more people coming in and out in a way that suggested that she might be a difficult boss. Some people went so far as to say a bad boss. But you and Dan have been doing reporting to kind of create a more nuanced picture of what Harris has been like as a manager and why that's important to us understanding her now as a presidential candidate.
Yeah, exactly. One of the dings against Kamala Harris was this narrative that she was somebody who churned through high-level Democratic talent. Now, these are folks who are used to hard jobs, right? Difficult jobs in the spotlight with weird hours and stuff, but that she couldn't sort of keep those folks in her office. I think her turnover rate in the Senate might have been something like 92%. And a lot of people have said, okay, this is an example that Kamala Harris is a bad boss, a bad person, not fit. She's going to run the federal bureaucracy. How can she do this if she can't run a Senate office? And one of the things we really focused on was what has happened in the years since all that negative publicity came out. Has she gotten it together? Has she figured it out? Does she have a better team, a more stable team?
And so, Cleve, what did you guys find about these questions about how much her reputation was substantiated and whether things have changed?
I think she kind of got it together. I mean, if I'm putting it simply, and it could just be a politician realizing that there's a political weakness and trying to shore up that political weakness. But she got a new chief of staff, Lorraine Voles, who has a master's degree in organizational management, is better at running organizations, and also is, kind of an old school Democratic player. I think there's, for a lot of the folks that we talked to who were with Harris in that first year, I think there was also a sense that some people came on because history or this moment, or even resume. They're ambitious people, right? And did not have a sense of the weightiness, the heaviness, the difficulty.
I mean, it's not like you're saying that they just couldn't hack it.
We didn't put the word hack in the story, but yes.
I thought the example that you gave in the story was really insightful, because when you hear about, like, why was there this turn? Why did people decide, I don't want to work here anymore? You brought up the question of Harris's prosecutorial style, which we've all seen play out in, Senate hearings.
We may see on Tuesday,
yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. But a lot of what she was doing in these meetings with her staff was asking pointed questions about footnotes and reports, or asking them to explain why certain items had been added to her schedule. And Dan got a quote from one former aide who says, quote, "It's stressful to brief her because she's read all the materials, has annotated it, and is prepared to talk through it." And I both sympathize with that, because I'm like, yeah, that does sound like a slightly scary moment when your boss is like, so why exactly did you decide that? And like, what exactly does this mean? But at the same time, like, that sounds like someone who's very prepared and expects the people around her to be prepared. And I think that starts to get mixed up in that question of like gender and race, and like how would we tolerate or respect or admire the same qualities in like a boss who's a white man?
Yeah, two things to that. One, we should grain of salt this and understand that these former staffers are Democrats who want Kamala Harris to be president. And we tried to be very clear about that. These are her former staffers, even the ones who disagree with her, even the ones who've been vocal about not liking her style or whatever in the past, have said, all that may be true, but I don't want Donald Trump to be president. I think the other thing is, yes, you're right. I think Harris does have a prosecutorial style. And as she has gotten more confident in her job, more confident in her role and all of that stuff, I think he's felt better about letting that on display. And one of the questions that I always try to ask myself in every story about Kamala Harris as a boss is, what is Joe Biden like as a boss? Because there is this question about whether or not a female boss has to be soft and gentle and bake you cookies and nice and conciliatory, whereas a male boss can cuss you out and be viewed very differently in that.
Well, I want to move on from here, because there's a lot of news that we want to get into from this week, including an endorsement that just came in for Kamala Harris. Aaron, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about this. Who is the relatively notable figure who has now decided that she will be endorsing Harris in this race?
Yeah, a couple big ones, actually, and from two people with the same last name. Liz Cheney said on Wednesday that she will be voting for Kamala Harris. And then on Friday, she said that her father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, will also be voting for Harris. I think this is the two most significant Republicans that we've seen saying that they're going to be voting for Harris. Obviously, Dick Cheney was vice president 2 vice presidents ago. The more recent vice president also isn't supporting Trump. Liz Cheney was a high-ranking member of House Republican leadership before she became co-chairwoman of the January 6th committee. And this really highlights a tension within the anti-Trump conservative movement right now about just how far to go in opposing Kamala Harris. Like, do you say that you're going to support her and endorse her, or do you just criticize Trump and kind of leave it at that? There is some discomfort with the idea that you're supporting someone who has a left-leaning record like Kamala Harris does. Certainly, the Cheneys are out of step with where the Republican Party is today in the Trump era. So Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney doing this is significant. I wouldn't necessarily expect a whole lot of Republicans to necessarily take their cues from the Cheneys, though.
Well, because there's a list, right, of people who are in similar situations as Liz Cheney who have been outspoken about their dismay with former President Trump, but who haven't actually come out for Harris. I mean, I'm thinking about like Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, obviously all senators or former senators, Chris Christie. Like those are names that jump out of folks who you could imagine a world where they might endorse Harris or at least like privately want Trump to lose, but that they're not saying that yet.
Yeah, there was also briefly a question about whether Cheney would show up at the Democratic National Convention. You know, there's always this, I shouldn't call them turncoats, but like, you know, the Republicans.
I think Republicans are calling them turncoats.
I wouldn't be the first one or the last, but she chose not to speak at the Democratic National Convention for whatever reason. She is a conservative Republican. It makes sense. And so I was actually a little bit surprised that she sort of came out because it seemed like the point where it would have the maximum impact was at that convention where everybody else is endorsing her.
But to me, I think it also gets to this question of like what happens to the non-famous people who are actually in a position to potentially like throw their vote over to Harris. And specifically, I've been wondering a lot about what is happening to these like Nikki Haley voters, like specifically the people who voted for Haley even after she dropped out of the primaries, but in the states where the primaries happened after her dropout point, that they were still voting in favor of her in what seemed like a real protest vote against Trump. Like, are those people going to vote for Harris?
Yeah, it's a big question. You know, are these voters looking at Dick Cheney or Liz Cheney endorsing Harris and thinking, oh, well, that's good enough for me. I guess I'll do it too. You know, are they looking at Adam Kinzinger doing it? You know, some of the speakers of the Democratic National Convention.
Another former Republican congressman.
Yeah, former congressman, also a January 6th committee member like Liz Cheney. I don't think that those specific Republicans are moving a lot of votes in the Republican Party towards Harris, but it does potentially give Republicans who are skeptical of Trump, more traditional, maybe hawkish on foreign policy Republicans, more of a permission structure to get over the hump with Harris.
I spend a lot of time at really pumped up political campaign rallies thinking about the people who are not there. Right? Because you kind of know how the people who are there doing the wave and the wobble and dancing to Beyonce are, it happens. I don't wobble professionally, but but you know how those people are going to vote. But the big question, and I think where this race may be decided, is with the folks who are not as enthused, who are not there, who are not going to stand in line for 3 hours to see Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, and are trying to weigh this decision while also balancing their job and their kids and whatever else may be going on in their lives. And I agree with Aaron, there's not a lot of data on those. Those folks are not as vocal. They're not calling me, trying to get into the Washington Post, but they do have opinions, and they, some of them exist in these swing states where the votes will be decided, where the race will be decided.
Speaking of people who are, I think, very excited to potentially wobble for Kamala Harris, we got some pretty eye-opening fundraising numbers from this past month that I just want to touch on briefly. The Harris campaign says that it raised an enormous amount of money in August, $361 million, and that is nearly triple what Trump raised. She had $109 million more in her account than Trump at the end of August. Aaron, I know you had a conversation earlier this week on the Campaign Moment with our colleague Marianne Levine about what that fundraising disparity means and where both campaigns are planning to spend that money, particularly when it comes to TV ads. And for folks who did not hear that episode, which was only on the Campaign Moment, I would absolutely recommend you go back and listen because I found it very insightful. But I think what's important to understand about this money, beyond the fact that Harris just has a lot more, is that Harris's campaign has also announced this week that they're going to be spending $25 million to help down-ballot Democrats. And of course, that was a big reason why Biden was pushed to step out of the race in the first place, was because the impression was that he was going to hurt down-ballot Senate and House Democrats who are trying to win their races. Aaron, I'm curious what you think is significant about the fact that Harris has so much money that she is in a position to throw some of that money to these House and Senate candidates.
Also, is this trickle-down economics? Are Democrats embracing it?
Trickle down.
30 years later, they're on board.
Kamalanomics. It's interesting. In one way, it's a flex. It's like, I have so much money, I can spread the wealth even as I'm running my own campaign. I'm going to help you guys out. It builds unity in the party because it looks like she's interested in what these the fate of these Senate candidates. But it is significant. In some ways, the amount of money that Harris is raising right now is probably going to be more than she could ever spend on TV ads. There is a finite amount of TV ad space in these swing states, and she's really spread the wealth already. Her ad reservations are pretty broad across these swing states in a way that Trump's aren't right now. But also, control of the Senate is hugely important for Harris if she does become president. And Democrats have a very difficult map right now. So they need to hold states like Montana and Ohio in order to win. The polling for them looks pretty good. They're winning in most of these swing states. They're winning in Ohio. Montana is the tough one for them right now. But if Kamala Harris wants to enact her agenda, she can't really do that if Republicans have a Senate majority. Senate Republicans have proven that they will stand in your way. There's, of course, the filibuster rules. And so this is a big part of Harris's potential to be a successful president if she's actually able to win. The other thing that I think is also notable here is that as she sent that money over to these Senate campaigns, we started to see Republicans start to complain about the lack of money that they have. So it's not just the presidential race where this seems to be an issue for the Republican Party. It's also in these down ballot races where Republicans are concerned that this fundraising disparity, this money disparity is potentially hurting them. And so that could be some pre-spin. Republican Senate candidates have had very disappointing results in recent election cycles. They've had poor candidates that haven't won very winnable races, have underperformed how you'd expect a Republican to do in those areas. So I think some of this is kind of a cover your backside in case this election goes wrong for Senate Republicans too. But also, I think it does speak to the fact that Republicans are underperforming in these races. The top of the ticket, the presidential race, is a lot closer than these Senate races. And I think whether that holds up is a really big question, not just in the 2024 election, but, for the future of governance in this country over the next 2 years.
Aaron, Harris has been saying we're the underdog in this race for a very long time. And maybe you could make that argument in the beginning when it's upended, but with the funding disparity and the seeming enthusiasm and the polling parity, I wonder, can you be the arbiter of who is I don't know if you have a scepter there, but of whether or not that's sort of a misnomer at this point?
I did look at this week for my newsletter where I did a big reset on the 24 campaign with 2 months to go. And the polling, the way it looks in the swing states right now, I would give Harris a slight edge, but not an overwhelming one. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that the only swing states where we see some significant or potentially significant separation between the two candidates is Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And both of those have Harris up by 3 or 4 points. If she can lock down those states, she's well on her way to getting towards 270. She probably just needs one more state at that point, depending on which state you're talking about. But, there is some question about how much her momentum is going to hold up. It looks like it's going to be very close. All these swing states, 5 of the 7 swing states are within a point right now in the Washington Post polling average. So this could go any number of different ways. And of course, we've had polling errors in the past that could, suggest these swing states all break one way or all break the other way. It's just very difficult to know at this point.
Polling errors give me nightmares.
I can imagine. Okay, we're going to take a brief pause there, and then after the break, we will talk about the debate next week, what to watch for. We'll be right back.
So the first presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is set for Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. This is going to be on ABC News. And the last time we had a presidential debate, you might have noticed a lot changed.
That is an understatement.
I wondered, Cleve, what do you think the stakes of this are relative to that? And in what ways are they different?
I don't think we'll see another candidate at the top if this
seems out of the question at this point.
It's J.D. Vance as a presidential candidate. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. I do think there's a couple of things at at play. One of the chief arguments of the Trump campaign is that you haven't really seen Kamala Harris in a lot of unscripted, untelepromptered moments, right? She had the interview with CNN, but beyond that, not a lot more. It's sort of like, okay, well, here's your chance, right? Here's your chance to give her an unscripted moment. I think the other thing that I'll be looking very, very hard at is which candidate has more, maybe the right word is control, right? I think for Trump, it's will he show sort of the lack of control that voters
like lack of control over himself,
control over himself, chaos. Voters that I've talked to over the last 4 years just say one of the things they don't like about Trump is that just this chaotic nature. You don't know what's going to happen. It's unpredictable. I don't want that in a president, right? I think that for Harris, she also has those sort of control over herself questions that have to be answered, but it's different. It is whether she gets frazzled or flustered. They're trying to paint her as an unqualified candidate who really is not up to snuff, who can't do it if there's not a teleprompter in front of her, and whether she's able to show a mastery of policy, a mastery of the situation. One of the things Trump somewhat misogynistically has said is that Harris is not going to be able to sort of hold her own in a room full of foreign leaders or a room full of generals and all of that stuff. And here's her chance to show that she can against, her biggest adversary.
Yeah.
Also, the one interesting thing, it will actually be the first time that Trump and Harris have ever met.
Right? Which I think is fascinating for the amount of time that they, I guess, spend thinking about each other.
Their lives are forever intertwined in history.
They never met
and this
before.
Is their first meeting with 50-some days before the election.
Yeah.
I think a couple things on this. Number one is the thing we remember about the June 27th debate is, of course, Biden's poor performance. And it was a poor performance that kind of, reignited a lot of existing concerns Americans had about his age and his capacity to do the job. But also it was a missed opportunity in that Democrats really wanted him to take the case to Donald Trump, to focus on things like Project 2025 and authoritarian tendencies and things like that. Yeah, abortion. And Biden, in addition to just kind of being uncertain on his feet and not projecting well, wasn't able to drive those things home. And so I think this is an opportunity for Harris to do that. Another question, is Trump needs to bring her down a peg. She right now is about even in her image rating, which is unusual in this political age. Like usually our candidates are more disliked than liked, and that's not the case with Harris right now. So Trump wants to do something about that, but trying to do something about that is a minefield for some of the reasons that Cleve mentioned, including race and gender. Is he going to turn off women voters by going after her too hard?
And he has this history of sort of intimidating women that he's in debates against, or at least Hillary Clinton.
Which is not a good look.
I'm imagine we're remembering the moment in 2016 of him sort of stalking Hillary Clinton around the debate stage as she was speaking,
and the ensuing Saturday Night Live skit that illustrated that very well.
Yeah. Anyways, continue with your point, Aaron.
Yeah, and remember, it wasn't that long ago after she jumped in the race where we had a bunch of Republican office holders coming out and saying Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate. And we saw some of the graybeards in the party step forward and be like, maybe you guys should knock that off. Like, this is kind of, maybe sounding a little bit racist at this point. Yeah. And Trump is certainly someone who has never demonstrated any real discipline when it comes to these things. Like maybe he hasn't said it as much recently, but is he going to be able to help himself when the candidate is right there in front of him and he can say whatever he wants about them? Like, the wisdom of his campaign advisors does not flow through Donald Trump's mouth very often. And so there are a lot of ways in which this could go. And I think it's going to be, I don't think the stakes of this are like they were on June 27th, just because, as mentioned, nobody's going to be dropping out after this, or probably not. But they are unusual even in the context of other debates, because Harris is a less defined political quantity, and also because this is probably the only debate we're going to see between these two candidates.
But I also think it's interesting to think about the ground rules of this debate and how that might affect how this all plays out. And what we're going to see on Tuesday night is pretty similar to actually what we saw between Trump and Biden back in June, in which there will be no live audience. The microphones will be muted when it's not the candidate's turn to speak. And notably, the candidates will not be allowed to ask each other questions. And I think, at least I found, and I think a lot of people found after that June debate, that those circumstances in some ways helped Trump because it made him seem more disciplined. The fact that he couldn't interrupt or jump in or kind of go off the rails in terms of how he was speaking on that stage. And I also wonder if this might hurt Harris too. I mean, we talked about her quote unquote prosecutorial style and the way that she can ask these cutting, pointed questions that strike fear into people's hearts. I mean, yes, she's going to be able to pose those questions in her answers, but she's not going to be able to ask Trump those things directly or kind of have a back and forth with him. And so I wonder if, and also the fact that there isn't going to be a live audience, it's one thing to make your case in an arena of people who love you and also may or may not be doing the wobble. And it's a different thing. And this kind of vacuum of just you and the candidate on stage or on TV. So yeah, I'm curious how you guys think the rules of this debate will affect how Harris performs and how Trump performs.
A lot of the voters that I have talked to over the years, when I asked them about Trump as a debater, they point to that first debate with Joe Biden where he just was constantly interrupting, constantly overbearing, constantly just not a self-possessed presidential-looking figure.
And this is the first debate as in 2020.
We're 2020, mm-hmm. Yeah. Where he didn't look like a very strong presidential figure. And so the muted mics this go-round help him more, I believe, in the eyes of those voters who I've talked to, because you're right, he can't. It reigns in some of that chaos. It reigns in some of that. The non-question, the not being able to pose questions to each other, I think might hurt Harris a little bit. Harris's best moments in her political career are when she is on the Judiciary Committee and she is giving it to, Trump's administration officials or to Brett Kavanaugh.
I'll repeat the question. Can you think of any laws that give the government the power to make decisions about the male body?
I'm not thinking of any right now, Senator.
Those are her best moments. And I feel like Harris has always been better when she's on offense asking questions as opposed to when she is trying to define herself and answer those questions. And so I'm not saying that it's going to be the end of her. There's all this debate prep that's going on, theater camp as she called it. But I do wonder what it's going to look like in a world where her sort of chief offensive strength is sort of declawed a little bit.
So we will be paying attention on Tuesday to see how Trump and Harris kind of navigate that minefield. We are running up against time, but before we go, I did want to try one thing this week to talk a little bit about what else has been going on in the news. And I'm curious, what is one other politics story that you both have read this week that you found interesting and would recommend to listeners?
Our colleagues Ashley Parker and Maeve Reston had a really great look this week at the impact that Project 2025 is having on the campaign. Of course, Project 2025 is this plan put forward by the Conservative Heritage Foundation, which included a lot of kind of extreme policies. And the Trump campaign has distanced themselves from it, even though there are a lot of overlaps between his world and it, a lot of people from his administration who worked on it. I just thought it was fascinating the level of detail this story had when it came to how much Republicans and Trump's campaign are scrambling to get away from this thing. That is really a pretty potent shorthand for Democrats when it comes to defining Trump as being too extreme, which is a big problem for him.
And it's trickling down. I use trickle down way too much, but I speak to a lot of voters.
The wobble is trickling down.
Yes, exactly. It's trickle down wobble. I talk to a lot of voters, and I do not expect those voters to be as well versed in matters of politics as, the people on this podcast. It's not their job. They have jobs and kids and stuff like that. And I talked to one woman yesterday who said she didn't watch the debate and she's been, just listening, obliquely to stuff, but not intensively. And she said, but the Republicans are writing a manifesto. She's talking about Project 2025. It is doing what the Democrats want it to do, which it is in the minds and in the ears of voters, and they associate it with the Republicans, even though the Republicans have tried to, particularly Trump has tried to distance himself from it. One story that I found interesting was by a little-known reporter named Aaron Blake about it was about improving opinion ratings of Joe Biden. And I just think it's fascinating because I cover Joe Biden for a living. And so I sometimes know more about what Joe Biden is doing than I know about what my kid is doing, if that makes sense. On Friday, Joe Biden is D.C., Michigan, Delaware, right? I know that Joe Biden has spent most of the last month on vacation in Rehoboth, in California, in Wilmington. And at the same time, I'm not discounting that Russian prisoner swap, but at the same time, these opinion ratings of Joe Biden are going up and up and up. And one of the things I'm really, really interested in just kind of is how history will reflect on Joe Biden. Will he be a footnote as the second president to not seek reelection? Or will they remember, the somewhat consequential 4 years that he's had? I mean, at one point, Joe Biden was saying he was the most consequential president in modern history as far as the things that he has accomplished. And I just wonder, when all is said and done, when the dust settles, when this race is decided, how will we all think about Joe Biden? And I also wonder what Joe Biden thinks about what we will all think about Joe Biden when everything is said and done.
Yeah.
I mean, the best thing that any president can do if they want to become popular is go to that beach in Delaware or go to Midland, Texas, and take up painting like George W. Bush
not be
did.
president anymore.
Like literally 2 years after George W. Bush went out of office and people, the vast majority of Americans disliked him because of the Iraq War and Hurricane Katrina. Like, by 2010, he was popular again. People liked George W. Bush all of a sudden. So there's something to be said for absence making the heart grow fonder and just like heading for the exits, certainly.
Well, we will link to both of those stories in today's show notes and at postreports.com so listeners can dive in more and get a better understanding of that reporting. And though we do have to wrap in just 1 second, I will tell you one story that is on my radar because it just came in just around now, the middle of the day on Friday. We got news about the sentencing in Trump's New York hush money case. As the both of you, of course, know, Trump was convicted in May of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. And this whole summer, we've been waiting for word on Trump's sentence, whether or not he's going to do any jail time. And his sentencing hearing had been scheduled for September 18th, which is just a little over a week from now. Well, the judge in this case, New York Supreme Court Justice Juan Merchan, just announced that he is delaying the sentencing until after the election. And it's going to be on November 26th. This is, of course, a pretty significant victory for Trump. Voters will cast their ballots in November, knowing that the Republican nominee has a felony conviction, but they will not know whether or not he's going to serve any time in prison. So, of course, we will be watching how this case continues to unfold and affect the election. It'll be very interesting. In the meantime, Cleve, thank you so much for joining us. This was so fun.
Always a blast. Thanks for having me.
And Aaron, thank you, as always, for all your wonderful insights.
Thank you. Thanks, Martine. And thanks, Cleve. And make sure that you're all subscribing to the Campaign Moment newsletter.
And you can find a link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com. Of course, Cleve Wootson is a White House reporter for The Post, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter.
That's it for this week on the Campaign Moment. Now, before you go, please make sure you're subscribing also to the Campaign Moment podcast. It's the only way that you're going to be able to hear all the other exclusive episodes that we're making from now until Election Day. We had one earlier this week, as we mentioned, digging into some of the swing states in the 2024 election. So be sure to look that up wherever you're listening. Today's episode was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy.
Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Lana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Brenny Spernovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Elahe Azadi. I'm Martine Powers.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.
Wobble, wobble.
Okay, so Cleve, I think you need to demonstrate the wobble for people who...
So
Can we make this a video podcast?
I think I can only do it when other people are doing it. Like you go front, then you go back, then you sort of do this weird cha-cha back and forth, and then you rotate. the best thing is when people have like clearly been wobbling for a while and they put their own stank on it. Like they just do their own, and you're like, oh, this is a creativity that you brought
the
to
wobble remix.